Hello, it's April 2022, and I'm going to be focusing on false memories in this video, and I'm going to go over the buffet table of examples and how this applies. Now, I've talked a lot about how false memories, for example, can be imposed on someone by themselves. They have an idea, they have a theory, opinion, belief, or desire or something, and then from there they start to manifest, for example, a memory of something, and it simply just takes off. And then they start forming conclusions. Now, I've also talked about how the studies made famous by Julia Shaw fits in with all this, and there's countless and countless of other people for many decades that have talked about false memories and implanting false memories. I've talked about how, for example, social justice movements are, in the people who are social justice warriors, are very susceptible to false memories. And it's as easy as, for example, let's take the whole myth of feminism and the foundation of that in today's world, and how we have the expansion of that to believe all women and Me Too and everything else. And I've also shared how and why I ended up exploring those tangents for many, many, many years, and even talking to world-renowned people who were former feminists who are now anti-feminists, talking about how destructive it is to society and creating a division between men and women. And I've talked about how we're all microfractured with divisions, and we may have common ground on one thing, but then there's everything else that will simply fracture us. It's actually kind of fascinating, and I've linked this, for example, with my story that I've been dealing with for the past 10 years, and I'm living the aftermath of it, and how false memories, well, there could be an agenda, and that agenda is eventually imposed as a false memory, as, well, this actually happened, and so forth. And then anyone who's listening in to or comes into, for example, my story, and they hear the false narratives, they just automatically assume that, and then they start formulating, because they start picturing what could have been, should have been, and to what was, and it just cascades from there. And I'm going to be talking about how false memories also link to information, knowledge, and misinformation. And again, people have talked about this for decades. So it's really nothing new, but it's things that I've been talking about for many, many years now. And once you start to explore the studies behind it, you really have to start questioning everything. And we know, for example, false information, misinformation, false memories can also even go back through to our history timeline. And even secular scholars say we're missing anywhere from 200 to 1,000 years of history. And what is told as history doesn't even make sense. Nothing fits. And this leads into other subtopics that, for some, they might just dismiss it as some crazy talk or woo-woo. And that's not going to be the point of this, although it'd be very interesting to link it all. So there's a lot of variables when it comes to false memories and how it impacts our daily lives. So when you look at these studies about convincing people, for example, that they've committed a crime or committed an act or something happened, whether it be even good stuff too, happy events, all these things, do they really exist? And if they do, there could be a foundation to it. To what extent do they exist or happened? And people build their identities around, for example, their experiences. Now, if they're remembering their experiences that, for example, their experiences have been exaggerated or skewed to not even happening ever, and people build their identities around that. Now you're dealing with people's emotions, who, when you try to say, well, listen, this is, you know, what actually happened, people become very emotional, and then you won't win trying to convince somebody of that their foundation of who they've built their character on is actually based on nothing. And we really see this, for example, with what I now call the old current worldwide events, and we're still kind of in the aftermath of that, and we're segueing into other current worldwide events and everything else, and how many people, for example, for the past 2 years have been told how a relative has passed on, and in their minds they accept that as the truth because it came from an authority, despite other authorities in the same profession saying, yeah, we're having memos saying that we, no matter what, we have to say this, and it's completely ignored. And then when you try to explain to people, for example, that, censor myself here, to question what's, what was really the cause and everything else, people get very emotional, and we see divisions now with just that alone in society, where friends and families and everyone have just been divided, and colleagues and acquaintances and strangers, because they're saying, well, in their minds they've believed this false narrative because a false memory has been implanted. So this whole idea, this whole thing with false memories is huge and very destructive. And one of the things I just want to highlight with my story is, since this began for me in 2012, and then in May 4th, 2013, it escalated beyond craziness, I had documented everything as best as possible, just to remember, to make sure that the facts are preserved. And anything that I did, I documented, and did it in such a way, in various ways, that could never be challenged. I have that to rely on. Plus, I have other independent sources of information, evidence, that further support. So even for myself, when I reflect back over the years and when all this began and everything else, I go back and I go over, say, for example, some what I would call journals and stuff, and notes and everything else, including videos and audios that I've made. And it's like, aha, okay, I remember that. And even for myself, over the years, I had to focus on the alleged obstruction and alleged assaulting a police officer, because, as I've told people the past 2 years, for not, for example, complying, going into a store, it doesn't matter how it started and whether it's just or not. You're now dealing with peripheral issues, peripheral charges or laws or whatever, and that's what you have, that's what you're going to be dealing with. So over the years, how it all started and everything else, and the whistleblowing and everything, I had to put that aside. Not that I ever forgot about it, but it wasn't in the forefront, because I was dealing with peripheral things. And that kind of, well, that did consume a lot of my thought and my efforts and everything else. And it's interesting when you look at people. There's a story that one of these professors who study false memories was talking about, how there was a guy and I guess his fiance, they were going to be married soon, went out for dinner, and then somewhere during this time when they were going back home, he was arrested for allegedly raping a woman that evening, when in fact he was at a restaurant with his fiance and everything else. And the conviction was simply based on the victim's recollection. In the recollection, she was shown a apparently a photo of him, and she said, well, yeah, that kind of looks like him. So we go from it kind of looked like him to the trial where she was absolutely 100% positive that was him. False memory. And we see how destructive that is. Anyway, I think it was about a year or so later, he was exonerated. They found the actual person who did it, and then it really consumed him, and he went to sue and everything else. And apparently a few days before his lawsuit, the proceedings were to start, he had a heart attack and died because of the stress. And I've had over the years stress-related issues, apparently with microstrokes, and I've already had some sort of pre-existing heart thing going on, and that elevated, plus all the injuries I sustained from the beating and everything else. So when you're trying to remember something or make sure that you have your facts correct, you need to rely on anything that you've documented or independent evidence to support it, which is what I do. And then we can kind of segue all this into, I'm going to use this as a descriptive. I hate using the word, but it's a word that everyone's going to be familiar with. And that's like supernatural things. And a lot of people have had these type of events. I call them woowoo. And a lot of times these types of events, it's nearly impossible to have anything to support it. However, sometimes there's residuals that you can rely on. There's some physical evidence, and even sometimes witnesses. And these are the things that I rely on to support anything that I've said. So the whole idea with false memories is not something that's new. And there's even, I'm trying to remember now, I think it was back in the 1970s or 80s. I think it's the 70s, where they were weaponizing false memories. And we see throughout history a form of this, maybe not as scientific, but through propaganda. And you keep promoting a narrative, false narrative. And regardless of all the protests and everything else, people in the controversy, you simply keep saying it. And eventually what happens is the resistance to the false information or the misinformation lessens and lessens and lessens, and then future generations read about the official narrative, which is false, and say, well, this must be it. And if they start digging, for example, with look at the I'm just trying to think of one example. I can't, just my mind just went blank. You start looking into it and you say, oh, there was controversy at the time. Now, we do have one in modern times, which has created a lot of divides, and even within people who on either side of the fence, it's divided because as to how, who, why, and everything else. And I mean, unless you're a part of it, you're never really going to know the truth of the matter. And you start digging into it, but future generations are going to, even for example, the past 2 years, future generations will, if we're even around, will start to look into it and go, you know, they'll read the official story and say, wow, that must have been a horrible time. And, you know, they're picturing some crazy, you know, things going on. Meanwhile, it was what it was, right? So, but if they start to dig into it, they say, hey, wait, what was all this controversy about? But then we're going to be dealing with a new batch, a new generation, generations down the road, that are going to be split and divided, just like we are now about other historical events. And well, I was thinking, one that popped out of my mind was the Titanic. And you start to dig into that, you're going to go, whoa, what was all this about? And you see the controversy at the time, and they just keep pushing that false official narrative and teach it even as a fact, as an absolute. So false memories have been going on for a long time in history with propaganda, but now perhaps this type of research has been known all along, but what we're starting to really see is the big huge push with implanting false memories, whether it be with the past couple of years to anything. We see people, innocent people, countless of innocent people, convicted because of false memories. Now, and I've also talked about how, for example, the studies made famous by Julia Shaw, when she convinced people that they committed a crime. Now imagine being an innocent person. You're traumatized, you're stressed, and maybe physically harmed, and you're dealing with so much and confusion, and especially if you're not familiar or you're intimidated by the legal system overall. There's a lot going on, and as you go through the proceedings and everything else, you start to doubt yourself. Well, maybe I did this. And we see a lot of examples of innocent people who pled guilty. They confessed, made confessions. Now there's forced confessions, coerced, which is completely different, but there are people who actually, well, yeah, maybe I did do it. So they confess or plead guilty, and then somebody along the way exonerates them, and they're in shock. They're trying to wrap their head around, well, what? I remember it. And I recall, was in the 60s, a lot of experiments done with implanting false memories, and they were using, this is here in Canada, with the liberal arts, theoretical pseudosciences of psychology, and they were using, there was American so-called practitioners of this nonsense doing experiments on people in Canada because laws were preventing them from doing it in their own country, so they go to a different country, and it happened to be Canada. And the same is done with these people from Canada going to other countries doing the same type of experiments, maybe even worse. And not to forget the physical experiments that are still being done to this day by countries. And going back to this experiment, I remember one case study that I read, and it was a long one. A woman had gone into this psychiatric facility, and they diagnosed her with some sort of nonsense or whatever else. And it was after she had a child. She just gave birth, so her hormones and everything were all over the map, which is a normal thing. I mean, it makes sense. What they did to her was, it was just under a month. I think it was like 3 weeks. I forget exactly how many days it stated. A long time ago that I read this. They had drugged her. They had put speakers in her pillow, confined her, tied her to the bed, and had this recording on a loop 24/7. Was sleep deprivation was involved, all sorts of things, and then induced sleep for long periods of time. And the recording said that she had killed her entire family. And it wasn't until she, I guess by the end of it, she had a breakdown because she was convinced that she killed her family, and she admitted to it. Yeah, they let her go. Well, her family came to pick her up, and she had a huge breakdown. And I think the family had tried to sue or was successful with the lawsuit with all that. But this type of thing, that's just one out of countless of examples of implanting false memories. So we know that this is very true. A lot of people, for example, and I'm going to mention this, talk about MK Ultra and everything else. Now, whether you want to accept it or not, that's not the point. The focus is not that. I'm just mentioning that because that whole program is used to break people, mentally, and then from what I understand is they try to split the personality, and they use the new personality for whatever purposes. Now, is that a far stretch to think that's real? No, because I've just talked about the studies made famous by Julia Shaw and countless of other people, the propaganda machines and everything else, how it's very real, very possible. And to split a personality, we see people who are traumatized having their personalities fractured, and then you start getting into multiple personality disorders where there's actually separate names for these personalities and sometimes within one person these multiple personalities may be aware of each other, sometimes not. Some may know of a couple. That's a whole separate tangent, but it's a way to deal with I'm keeping in the theme with this, the false memories. So one personality, say if it's split in two, has a whole false existence, and the other one is the real one, and whatever. But this is a very, very real thing, and it challenges not only each individual, but society overall. It challenges knowledge, information that you may read about, you may learn, even study something, but if you're recalling it inaccurately, or there's information that contradicts that, we have problems. And I've mentioned also that a lot of people, they're wanting to learn, which is fine. But there comes a time when I'm going to use this as probably a very poor descriptive, a loose descriptive, when learning stops, say, on a particular topic. And I'm going to expand on this right now. So if you start going down what people call all these rabbit holes, which is fine, and people are addicted to that. People are addicted to all sorts of things. And you convince yourself that there's never an absolute. Well, you can walk right past the truth because, it's just another rabbit hole, and you don't recognize, well, wait a second, this is the truth. These are the facts. So when you start clouding your perceptions with too much information, that allows for false memories. You start forming opinions, beliefs, theories, wants, desires, and especially now when your emotions are attached to it, you're not going to break it, or you're not going to convince anyone else that, well, wait a second, think this through. Okay? So I just wanted to really just highlight about false memories and how it's very real. And some people, apparently a lot of people, if you go, depending on what numbers you're looking at, I would use a descriptive as most people are impacted by false memories, and there's different levels to it. Now, some people you might want to call stubborn, they're pretty firm, they're harder. It's almost like people when they're being hypnotized. Not everyone can be hypnotized. Not everyone has drugs affecting them the same way, right? So the same with these implanting false memories. But then how do you recognize those people, especially if you're somebody who, as a descriptive, a victim of having false memories implanted? So the only real solution, as crazy as it sounds, is if there's something, say you know there's an event going to happen in your life, good or bad, doesn't matter, or an event has happened, good or bad, and you want to really remember it. What you need to do is document it right then while it's still fresh. We also have the issue of perceptions, which can skew reality. But what are you going to do? You do the best that you can. At least you can document it, film it, record it, take pictures, have something. And then if, depending on what it is, you might have some independent evidence to support it. And that's really the only way to guess you can say, deal with it to. But then even if you have this, depending, say for example, if it ends up being a legal thing, well then now you're dealing with, will it be accepted or not, which is absolutely absurd. And we get into law being like theoretical mathematics, neither of which having a basis in reality. So yeah, I just wanted to really skim over a whole bunch of different examples how false memories impact individual, society, history, you name it, and how destructive it can be. Now we can have also positive false memories, remembering something that is pleasant, you know, a good experience. And then we get into people romanticizing something. And I've talked about this as well over the years. People romanticizing, for example, who they are, their role, how something is going to, the outcome of something, an event or whatever. And people create these false memories. And then when you look at, for example, people who have protests, and even historical protests, people romanticize that, and they convince themselves, yes, I did something, I participated, there was whatever. So
natural immunity helps, but isn't going to be the salvation for someone if they contract AIDS. Even someone if they contract AIDS.
It really, this whole thing with false memories really challenges our lives, our existence. What do you believe? And we get into perceptions and interpretations. Two people can be looking from, say, at one object, in between them, from opposite sides, have two different interpretations. And if somebody is able to walk around the object, they'll have more understanding of what they're observing and have a more expansive interpretation of what they're looking at, whereas the person who only sees it from one angle can only base it on whatever limited knowledge base they have. And then we get into pride, where people don't want to listen because, well, who are you, type of thing. Anyway, I just wanted to give you a lot to think about. And yeah, thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, comment, and share.